She texted at 11 in the morning on December 30th. Not a call, a text, which was how she delivered things she had thought about before saying. She said, "I don't want to go to a party this year. Can I come to yours instead?" I didn't have a party. She knew I didn't have a party. What I had was an apartment, a good bottle of something, and the genuine intention of watching the countdown alone for the 4th year running and being fine with it. I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll bring the food." She arrived at 8 with 2 paper bags and the kind of energy that meant she had been looking forward to this, which I filed under. She was dreading the alternative. She had been invited to 3 parties. I knew this because she'd told me. In the specific way, she told me things she was still deciding, not asking for advice, just needing to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't make it more complicated. Nora Chen did not skip parties because she had nowhere else to be. She skipped them because she decided somewhere else mattered more. She was wearing the gray jumper she wore when she was being comfortable rather than visible, which was information I had, and which I noticed, and which I did not yet know what to do with. I had not finished processing any of this before she was in my kitchen asking where I kept the good pen. My name is James Whitfield. I'm 32. I teach architecture at a university in the same city I grew up in, which gives me an unusual relationship with the familiar. I have been looking carefully at things other people stopped seeing years ago, which is either the best part of the job or the occupational hazard, depending on the week. I live in an apartment that has a very good east-facing window and not enough bookshelves, which is a problem I have been intending to solve for 3 years. Her name was Nora Chen. She was 31. She was a product designer at a tech company. She built the parts of digital things that people touched, which she said required understanding how a person felt before they knew what they wanted. She was very good at it. She was also, it occurred to me more frequently than I had let myself examine, good at most things she applied herself to: cooking, plants, the specific art of being in a room with someone who was having a bad week without making it worse. She had a pair of reading glasses she wore only at home, small and slightly too round for her face, which she pushed up her nose when she was concentrating, and which I had noticed approximately 1,200 times in 7 years without once mentioning. She had a habit of stealing the corner piece of anything baked, and then denying she had done it while holding the evidence. We had been best friends for 7 years. She had met me at the architecture school's public lecture series. She had come for the topic, I had been presenting it. She had disagreed with my central argument in the Q&A, and I had said she was right, which I later understood was the moment she decided I was worth knowing. We had been friends in the way that some friendships become the structural element of a life, not decorative, not occasional, but load-bearing. She was the person I called when something went wrong. She was also, and this had become increasingly difficult to reason around, the person I thought of when something went right. I had been managing this for approximately 2 years. I had been managing it poorly. The thing about being best friends with someone is that the category provides an enormous amount of cover. You can notice things and file them under friendship. You can feel things and call them familiarity. You can want to be in the same room as someone almost constantly and describe it as having a lot in common. I had been doing all 3 of these things for 2 years with a precision that embarrassed me in retrospect. There had been a September 2 years before the New Year's Eve, when she had called me from outside a restaurant at 9:30 on a date that had gone wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just quietly and thoroughly wrong in the way some things are, and she had said, "Can I come over?" I had said yes before she finished asking. She arrived with her coat still on and sat on my kitchen stool, and I made tea, and she told me the whole evening in the specific way she only talked to me, without editing for an audience, from the actual beginning, including the part where she knew by the appetizer and still stayed for dessert because she didn't want to be unkind. I had sat across from her and listened to the whole thing and thought, I will spend as long as she needs me to listening to this, which is not a thought that has a clean category in a friendship. She had stayed until midnight. She had borrowed the gray sweater I kept on the hook by the door. She had returned it washed, folded, left on my doorstep with a note that said, "Thank you for the tea and the not making it weird." I had kept the note. I had not examined why I had kept the note. There had been a February when we had both attended a friend's wedding and had ended up at the same table for the reception dinner, and had spent 3 hours talking to each other in the way you talk when there is background noise and you have to lean close to be heard. And she had laughed at something I said, and the laugh had landed near my ear, and I had thought, this is a better evening than most evenings, which was an observation about proximity that I had filed, as usual, under friendship. There had been the April when she had sent me a photograph of a door she'd seen on her commute. An old door, painted green, with specific proportions. And the text had said, "Thought you'd want to see this." I had stared at the photograph for longer than a door merited. I had sent back, "The proportions are right." She had sent back, "I knew you'd say that." I had thought about the fact that she knew what I'd say about a door for the rest of the week. I had not told her this. I had been managing all of this, as I said, poorly. She made the food she always made when she wanted the evening to be good. The dumplings she'd learned from her mother, which required more time than the occasion appeared to justify, and which she made anyway on purpose. I opened the wine. She worked at my counter in the reading glasses she'd brought without commenting on bringing them, and I sat on the kitchen stool, and we talked the way we always talked, which was without effort, and from wherever the thought actually started, not from where it was safe to start. She said, "Tell me something you've been thinking about." I said, "I've been thinking about the east window." She said, "The window in this apartment." I said, "It gets the light right in the morning. Not just adequate light, the kind of light that justifies the room." She looked up from the dumplings. She said, "You've been here 3 years, and you're still thinking about the window." I said, "It keeps being worth thinking about." She looked at me for a moment over the reading glasses. Then she went back to the dumplings. I have, for 7 years, been in the habit of telling myself that what I noticed about Nora Chen was simply attentiveness. That I remembered the reading glasses because I was observant. That I knew about the corner piece because I paid attention to things in general, and she happened to be one of those things. I have the architectural training to know the difference between a detail and a load-bearing element. I had been classifying incorrectly for 2 years. This was, in the profession of a person who built his career on reading structures correctly, not a flattering assessment of my own judgment. We ate at the kitchen table, which was more honest than the living room, and which we both knew it. She told me about the project she'd been working on, an interface redesign that had been resisted at 3 levels of the company, and that she was finally winning. And she talked about it the way she talked about things she cared about. With her hands, with specific detail, with the implicit understanding that I was the person she told the real version to, not the professional version. I told her about the studio project I'd assigned, and the student whose solution had made me reconsider an assumption I'd been carrying for 6 years. She said, "Which assumption?" I told her. She said, "I think you've been wrong about that for longer than 6 years." I said, "Probably." She said, "That's good. You're improving." We moved to the sofa at 10. There was a film we'd talked about watching that we didn't watch. There was a conversation instead. The kind that starts somewhere ordinary and arrives somewhere true without either person deciding to go there. She told me about a relationship that had ended in November. Quietly, mutually, in the way things end when they were never quite right, and both people had known it and had been kind to each other about it. She said, "I think I've been dating around something I already know." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean the person I actually want to talk to about most things is never the person I'm trying to make things work with." I said nothing for a moment. She said, "That's probably something I should think about." I said, "Probably." She looked at me. I looked at the window, which was doing its nighttime version, dark and reflective, the city reduced to lights. I had been looking at windows carefully for a long time, and I understood, in that moment, that I had been looking at the wrong window for most of the evening. She picked up her wine and looked at it. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes," she said, "when I asked to come here tonight instead of the parties. What did you think that meant?" I thought about being careful and decided not to be. I said, "I thought it meant you wanted to be here specifically, not away from the parties specifically." She said yes. She said, "That's what it meant." We sat with that. The city outside was getting louder, the way cities get in the last hour of the year. The particular sound of many people deciding the same thing matters. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about what you just said." She said, "Which part?" I said, "The part about the person you actually want to talk to." She said, "Yes." I said, "Is it someone specific, or is it a description?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city was doing its New Year's Eve things, distant noise. The particular energy of a night that has an ending people have agreed to care about. The wine was almost gone. The reading glasses were on the coffee table between us. She said, "James, it's a description of a specific person. Something happened in my chest that I would describe as the structural equivalent of a load-bearing wall finally being identified. Not new, the load had been there for a long time. Just named." I said, "I have been describing that same specific person for approximately 2 years and calling it friendship." She said, "I know." I said, "You know." She said, "I've known for about 8 months. I've been deciding what to do with it." I said, "Why didn't you say anything?" She said, "Because I was afraid you would be kind about it." She looked at her hands. She said, "You are very good at being kind about things, and I didn't want kind. I wanted." She stopped. She said, "I wanted what we're doing right now." I said, "What are we doing right now?" She said, "Being honest in a kitchen at 11:30 on New Year's Eve." I said, "This is the sofa." She said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I do." I said, "I should tell you something." She said, "Okay." I said, "I have been noticing the reading glasses for 7 years. I have never mentioned them because I was telling myself it was a small observation. It is not a small observation. I have been noticing everything about you and calling it friendship, and the word has been getting heavier every year." She said, "Tell me something else." I said, "You steal the corner piece of every baked thing and then deny it." I've been letting you deny it because watching you hold the evidence is one of my favorite things that happens." She laughed. The real kind, sudden and full, and then staying. She said, "I didn't think you knew about the corner piece." I said, "I've known for 5 years." She said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I said, "Same reason." She looked at me then. She looked at me the way you look at something you've been carrying for a long time, and have finally put down, not lighter exactly, but more honest about the weight. She said, "I asked to come here tonight because I wanted to be in the same room as the person I actually think about when I think about a good evening." I said, "This is a good evening." She said, "Yes." She said, "It's not midnight yet." I said, "No." She reached over and she took my hand, which was not a dramatic gesture and was not meant to be. It was the gesture of someone who had made a decision and was done waiting for the right moment, because she had understood that the right moment was the one you made. She held it. We sat. Outside the city did its countdown, and inside we were already on the other side of it. At midnight, somebody set off fireworks 2 blocks over. Through the east window, the light arrived in colors: red, then gold, then white. She looked at the window. I looked at her looking at it. She said, "It's a good window." I said, "I've been saying that." She said, "I know." She turned and looked at me, and she was smiling the smile she used for things that were finally correct. And she kissed me, quietly, without ceremony. The way you do something you have been considering carefully for long enough that the action is simply the end of the thought. The fireworks went on for 12 minutes. I know because we watched all of them. 6 months later, she moved in, which was practical in the way that things are practical when they've been true for longer than they've been acknowledged. She has opinions about the bookshelves that are better than my opinions about the bookshelves. She is right that they should go on the north wall, which I had been resisting on grounds that no longer seemed coherent to me. She takes the corner piece, and now she doesn't deny it. She offers me the second corner piece, which is her version of sharing. The reading glasses are on the nightstand. She redesigned the interface of how the kitchen worked within 2 weeks of moving in. I told her she had no authority over the kitchen layout. She said, "I design how people interact with things for a living." I said, "This is my apartment." She said, "It's our apartment." I had no response to that. She was also correct about the layout. A year after New Year's Eve, when people asked how we got together, she told it from the dumplings. She said, "I made the good dumplings for someone who didn't realize what that meant. And then I waited until 11:30 to tell him what it meant." I always said I realized what it meant by the time she got out the pan. She always said, "No, you didn't." I always said, "I realized what the window meant." She always said, "That's different." I said, "It's the same thing." She said, "It is not the same thing." We have not resolved this. I think we won't. It is the best ongoing argument I have. Nothing had been missing from 7 years of friendship. We had simply been carrying the same thing in the same direction without saying so. And it had taken a New Year's Eve with no party and good dumplings and an east-facing window, doing its nighttime best to finally hand us the right moment to put it down together. What would you have done if your best friend skipped 3 parties to spend New Year's Eve with just you, and midnight arrived before you had the right words? And have you ever been carrying something for years that the other person was also carrying, and neither of you knew the other one knew? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.